Okay, Grandpa Christie's back. Let's do this. 1 page 177, Rhyme the Reason. Brave New World excerpt. Let's rock. The room into which the three were ushered was the controller's study. His lordship will be done in a moment. The Gamma butler left them to themselves. Okay, his lordship instead of his lordship. The Gamma butler, so remember the Gammas are the third of 5 levels, so that's somebody who's not smart enough to be doing super intellectual work, so he's doing sort of, mid-level work, so people really being measured by intelligence. Reminds me of something. Okay, so let's keep reading. The Gamma butler left them to themselves. The savage wandered restlessly around the room, peering with vague, superficial inquisitiveness at the books on the shelves. On the table under the window lay a massive volume bound in black leather surrogate. He picked it up and read it, and opened it. My Life and Work by R. Ford. Idly he turned the pages, read a sentence here, a paragraph there, and had just come to the conclusion that the book didn't interest him when the door opened and the resident world controller for Western Europe walked briskly into the room. Okay, so My Life and Work by R. Ford seems like it might be a replacement for the Bible. The savage is not interested in it. And then the world controller for Western Europe, so that's Mustafa Mond, has walked into the room. Now, Mustafa Mond, like Bernard Marx, like a number of other characters, is, plus alpha, highly intelligent, and he is basically sort of the president of this part of the world. Mustafa Mond shook hands with all 3 of them, but it was to the savage that he addressed himself. So you don't much like civilization, Mr. Savage, he said. The savage looked at him. He had been prepared to lie, to bluster, to remain unresponsive, but reassured by the good humoured intelligence of the controller's face, he decided to tell the truth straightforwardly. No, he shook his head. Of course, he went on to admit, there are some very nice things. All that music in the air, for instance. Okay, this is a good moment to point out again that Brave New World has some really nice things because it controls people through pleasure. So 1984 controls people through pain, Brave New World controls people through pleasure, and you're not allowed to express yourself, your individuality. You're not allowed to sort of be your own person or experience, and you're not allowed to have children or worship God or any of these things, but you're sort of controlled and sculpted even before you're born into being a certain version of yourself. So there's a lot that's very similar to 1984, even though the means with which that control is inflicted is radically different. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about my ears, and sometimes voices. Okay, that's a quote from Shakespeare, from The Tempest. Now, Mustafa Mond, like O'Brien in 1984, is allowed certain indulgences that the average person isn't, and Mustafa Mond is allowed to access to things like Shakespeare. Normal people are not. The savage's face lit up with a sudden pleasure. Have you read it too? He asked. I thought nobody knew about that book here, in England. Of course, there's irony in that. Shakespeare's the greatest author to ever come out of England, and the idea that he could be forgotten in England is, of course, interesting. Almost nobody. I'm one of the very few. It's prohibited, you see, but as I make the laws here, I can also break them. But why is it prohibited? Asked the savage. In the excitement of meeting a man who had read Shakespeare, he had momentarily forgotten everything else. The controller shrugged his shoulders. Because it's old. That's the chief reason. We haven't got any use for old things here. Even when they're beautiful? Particularly when they're beautiful. Beauty's attractive, and we don't want people to be attracted by old things. We want them to like the new things. But the new ones are so stupid and horrible. Why don't you let them see Othello instead? Okay, Othello is one of Shakespeare's great tragedies. It's a story in which a man is deeply, deeply in love with his wife, in that sort of old possessive way, and he is tricked by a man who he believes is his friend but is actually his enemy into believing that his wife is cheating on him, and he's basically driven mad by this belief, and he murders his wife, and then only then realizes or is told that the whole thing was a lie. It's an incredibly tragic and beautiful story, and very much not the kind of thing that you should be engaging with in Brave New World. I've told you, it's old. Besides, they couldn't understand it. Our world is not the same as Othello's world. You can't make tragedy without social instability. The world's stable now. People are happy, they get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. They're well off, they're safe, they're never ill, they're not afraid of death, they're blissfully ignorant of passion and old age, they're plagued with no mothers or fathers, they've got no wives or children or loves to feel strongly about, they're so conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave. And if anything should go wrong, there's Soma, which you go and chuck out the window in the name of liberty, Mr. Savage. Liberty, he laughed, expecting doubters to know what liberty is? And now expecting them to understand Othello? My good boy. This is a very interesting worldview. The idea is that it's better to sacrifice the extremes of happiness if you can also sacrifice all the extremes of misery. So we can experience extremes of happiness, like when your first child is born, or on your wedding day, but then we'll also experience these incredible lows of misery, when our spouse dies or when we get divorced. And so we have these highs and lows in our lives, like each and every day of our lives is sort of highs and lows, right? Like, you're always sort of going up and down in your emotional range every single day, and that's part of being human. This worldview has decided that it's best to avoid or delete or remove all of those negative experiences from life, which also, of course, deletes all the positives. Like if you're going to have these highs of falling in love and having children and all the wonderful positive things we can experience in life, of course, when you lose those things or something goes wrong with those things, you experience these incredible lows. But this society, it's removed mothers and fathers, wives, children, falling in love. It's gotten rid of all that stuff, so you don't experience the highs or the lows. So instead of life being sort of like an experience that's like this, like up and down, highs and lows, you're sort of always sort of going in the sort of middle range. And in that version of life, a story like Othello, you can't even really recognize the emotions behind it. This is a society in which nobody falls in love. Or gets married, so how could you possibly understand the concepts in Othello that make it a tragedy? Now, the savage believes that you need to have these extremes. That's what life is about, and that's how we've created great pieces of artwork. That's why we appreciate things like beauty. But Mustafa Mond's, his idea is that basically it's better to be safe and to not get sick than to experience these extremes. Okay. The savage was silent for a little. All the same, he insisted obstinately. Othello's good. Othello's better than those feelies. Okay, the feelies are the way people don't just go and watch a film in this world. They can also feel it, so it becomes a sort of added an extra dimension to the experience of watching a film. You sort of can feel things with the movie, and you read the book if you want to understand more about that. Of course, the controller agreed, but that's the price we pay for its stability. You've got to choose between happiness and what people call high art. We've sacrificed the high art. We have the feelies and the scent organ instead. The savage shook his head. It all seems to me quite horrible. Of course it does. Actual happiness always looks pretty squalid in comparison with the overcompensations of misery. And of course stability isn't nearly so spectacular as instability. And being contented has none of the glamour of a good fight against misfortune, none the picturesqueness of a struggle with temptation, or a fatal overthrow by passion or doubt. Happiness is never grand. I think with 1984, you read it and you think, God, that's just that's not what we want. The thing that's really Brave New World is you can kind of see what both of them are saying. And there's something about what version of Brave New World. Eventually, by the end of the novel, you read and you think, this is not what we want. But there's times when you read about the lives that these people live and you think, this doesn't seem too bad. So it's a very seductive version of a dystopian reality like this. Yeah, I wouldn't want to live there, but you can see parts of his point. His point is a lot more seductive than O'Brien's, and that I think is part of its evil. Okay, so in the story here, we jumped to those ... to actually delete a little bit of the conversation. And now, from line 56, That's the savage talking. He's telling a story, an old folk story from the reservation. There's a story one of the old Indians used to tell us about the girl of Matsaki. The young men who wanted to marry her had to do a morning's hoeing in her garden. It seemed easy, but there were flies and mosquitoes, magic ones. Most of the young men simply couldn't stand the biting and stinging, but the one that could, he got the girl. Charming. But in civilized countries, said the controller, you can have girls without hoeing for them, and there aren't any flies or mosquitoes to sting you. We got rid of all of them centuries ago. The savage nodded, frowning. You got rid of them? Yes, that's just like you. Getting rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. He's quoting there from Hamlet. I don't know why the Rhyme and Reason doesn't have a note there to tell you what that is. He's quoting there from a very famous speech from Hamlet in which Hamlet reflects or muses about whether or not it's braver, nobler to suffer through the challenges of life or the miseries of life. So the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, those are all the challenges that life brings us, or to commit suicide. So what is the nobler choice? To suffer onwards through life, or to just be like, or to kill yourself. So that's what and it's some 50 lines or something, that speech that Hamlet is musing on this question. So the savage really, really hates the fact that they have gotten rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it, because learning to struggle is for the savage what helps us to find meaning in life. And for him, he feels that the lives led by these people in Brave New World are incredibly shallow and they're not really living at all. And I have to say I agree with him. I think struggle helps us to find meaning, and to be truly happy you need to know what it is to be truly in pain. Just like you remember a few weeks ago I was talking to you about sort of things like you can't know beauty without ugliness, you can't know pleasure without pain, and you know, dark and light, you know, all of these sort of binary oppositions. You need to know one to know the other. And that is the argument I think that the savage is trying to make. Okay, let's finish this. But you don't do either, neither suffer nor oppose. You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy. What you need is something with tears for a change. Nothing costs enough here. Exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune. Isn't there something in that? He asked, looking up at Mustapha Mond. Quite apart from God, though of course God would be a reason for it, isn't there something in living dangerously? There's a good deal in it, said the controller replied, but we prefer to do things comfortably. But I don't want comfort. I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. In fact, said Mustapha Mond, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right, said the savage defiantly, I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. I claim them all, said the savage at last. Mustapha shrugged his shoulders. You're welcome, he said. Okay, fascinating stuff. The point, I think, is that these people aren't really living. Suffering makes us who we are. It makes us more interesting and compelling people. It makes us more capable people. Nietzsche famously said that he wishes suffering on all the people he cares about, that suffering is actually incredibly important. And I think the core of Brave New World, what Huxley's really worried about is that by erasing all of the things that are difficult about life, we're losing the very thing that makes us human. Fascinating stuff. I'm going to do a lesson on chapters 1 and 2. I've decided. I really think it's difficult for you to understand this excerpt without me giving you more information about this world. So stay tuned for that. And but right now you have to go to Moodle, and because we're going to have a group chat together. So I'll see you all there. Bye.